Shots fired!
As a police officer, you know you're going to be held accountable. So any use of force, putting hands on people, handcuffing them, etc. And for armed police officers, you could be ultimately held responsible and accountable for taking someone's life. And that's what Sergeant Blake faced. So he knew he was going to be held accountable. It's exceptionally rare for a police officer to be named in this situation because they are at work, they're doing their duty, they're in a difficult and challenging situation where they make that decision to pull the trigger. But you expect some sort of protection from the justice system until you are convicted to remain anonymous because of exactly what we're finding out now, because of the possible threats, depending who you're dealing with. We are dealing with, in many cases, so not specifically this case, but in many cases, violent criminals, members of gangs, members of crime initiatives, etc., crime organisations. So, police officers working in exceptionally challenging situations against highly dangerous individuals, you'd expect some form of protection until the court case is concluded. If you're then convicted and found guilty, absolutely, you are then named at that point. But up until that point, and this is where the adage comes in, innocent till proven guilty for me, and for police officers doing their job, as in some other professions, I think that anonymity should remain. And as we're now discovering, significant threats to the officer and their family, enabling house moves, house sales, school moves, etc. So I think that's a question that needs to be addressed by government, needs to be reviewed by government, that whole policy about naming officers who are under investigation or been charged with an offence prior to conviction. There was reporting restrictions, as I expected, throughout the trial. So I had the sense there was a background or history to this that didn't seem to come up during the trial. And in my view, rightly so, the judge decided it wasn't linked to the case itself. The officers didn't know who was in the car. That was almost like part of the defence. It was still an unknown threat risk. It was the vehicle that was linked to the shooting and the possibility there was still a firearm in the vehicle with whoever was the occupant. So in relation to Mr. Kaba, the background, etc., wasn't ultimately relevant to the case that the jury were hearing. So I could completely understand why a judge made that decision and put the reporting restrictions in place. But once the verdict come in and Sergeant Blake was acquitted of all charges, for me, then we needed to get the background out, the context, the threat, the risk, etc., from the individuals or the groups that these officers were facing on that night. They're not to know who it was in the car, but they know there was significant tension and risk, threats to life in that area by members of gangs. And they would like to have a member of one of those gangs in that vehicle with already a propensity to use firearms and discharge them in the street. So that's the threat and risk they were facing. So for me, I understood why the judge made some decisions, but the anonymity one, I still can't rationale the decision there as to why you'd have to name the officer prior to the trial, because as we're now hearing, it put them under significant risk, and I think that's unjustified. If officers are fearful of how they're going to be judged and then identified, I think the identity thing is the big thing. They almost expect to be held accountable, and rightly so, for your decisions. So you go to work knowing that if you use force and lethal force, you will be held to account for it. You have to justify it. But I think it's the anonymity side of it, the identity side of things, that's affecting people around you. The concern there is that officers now going out on the street will second guess it, will pause and pause at the wrong places when faced with a threat or a risk. That's the danger we face now, is we're putting officers in already a dangerous position. If they start pausing or hesitating, they're putting themselves and their colleagues at risk because of this whole situation about it's not just them being put at risk, it's people close to them. I think that's the danger we face, which is why, in my view, this needs urgent review by the government and the justice system for police officers in these sort of situations, in these sort of roles, when this sort of incident happens, which thankfully is exceptionally rare. Thousands of times they're deployed, and it's in single figures of times that a firearm is discharged by a serving police officer. So exceptionally rare occasions, but it does still need addressing because the concerns are there that officers will start to hesitate or pause or second guess it because they're fearful of the outcome.